Well, I think we're going to start. We're going to continue on talking about spiritual exercises. In the first talk or so, we developed criteria for judging and selecting spiritual exercises, which is necessary since there are so many spiritual exercises, and they all work one way or another. Thus, how they work and what kind of people we want to become by performing them becomes very important to look into. So that's why we've been developing criteria. Then for the last couple of talks, we began introducing some safe, simple, basic exercises. We looked at the introvertive and extrovertive concentration exercises. The introvertive being observation and discrimination, and the extrovertive being concentration, meditation, contemplation, and adoration, utilizing the principles of going into concentration and then through that automatically transcending and transferring consciousness to the next higher level. The most basic part of that being thinking and creating thought forms, and when we do that and keep at it and work at it, we become more and more aware of who the thinker is. And then when we know who the thinker is, we can transcend and refocus our consciousness into the thinker, which is our spiritual being, our selfhood, and then we have entered into a state of meditation. Last time we specially focused on all kinds of different ways of looking at concentration. These exercises were introduced first for a reason. There's a reason why we do things in the order that we do them. And that reason is obvious, that we need to have control of our faculties. We need to be in control of our consciousness, and if we are not in control of our consciousness and the tools that our consciousness expresses itself through, we can't hope to have success in anything else we do. Control is exceedingly important. We mentioned yesterday that the brakes of a car have to be several times, I think it's either 6 or 7 times stronger than the engine of the car. Because if the brakes aren't strong enough, you can't stop it, and then you don't have control. Similarly, if things are happening in our soul, in our consciousness, and we can't stop them, or we can't redirect them, we are psychologically or psychically, we are as much a menace to other people as if we have a car with no brakes or with poor steering. If we can't say no, then what we have developed is of dubious value. As we master the basic skills, it's not ending. We saw that yesterday. We looked at some pretty deep levels of concentration, and there are yet deeper levels that one can go to. It's as one masters, not after one has mastered, because one doesn't come to an end. If we're talking about spiritual unfoldment, if we're talking about spiritual becoming or developing, we're talking about something that's eternal. And as a consequence, all of the exercises that we do must also be eternal. You know, when we learn to drive a car, we don't just practice starting and stopping. We use the car to go somewhere. And we're constantly having to improve our skills. For me, coming to California and going down that freeway was certainly... Yeah, yes. Now this analogy of driving is not ideal. because we see that the exercises carry us to progressively deeper levels, and that doesn't happen with driving. Nonetheless, it's a good analogy or a good metaphor to get started with things. In this talk, we're going to talk about an exercise that does something simple and something very important. There is a name for it in the Rosicrucian philosophy. It is called retrospection. Retro meaning back, spection meaning looking. And it is an exercise of looking back. And among many things, what this exercise accomplishes is the reaping of soul power for soul growth. It does accomplish other things, and we'll get to them along the way. But before we do anything, it seems wise to discuss the meaning and philosophy of the term soul power. In fact, next week we're going to have several talks on that subject because it's central to everything we do. Now, there are issues that produce criteria for differentiating spiritual philosophies and their outcomes. That is, what we become by following a philosophy and especially by practicing its exercises. But before any of that, we have to do something very delicate. We have to speak comparatively of spiritual philosophies. And when we do that, it's always a delicate matter because people have their whole life bound up in philosophies. And there are a lot of misunderstandings, and people even get hurt because they identify with a philosophy. And anytime we identify with anything, we give part of ourself to it, and that means there is attachment. So identification and attachment are not the same thing as commitment. We can be committed to a way of life, but if we identify with that way of life and attach ourselves to that way of life, we weaken ourselves. I don't have any malice toward any philosophy or the adherents of any philosophy. For the most part, I have close, dear friends in most of the major religions and philosophical organizations in the world. I do find all philosophies beneficial, and I find them important. But when I say that, I'm a little bit hesitant, and I have to tell you a story of how it happened. A few years back, one morning I was at home, and I think I was doing house cleaning or something like that, and there's a knock at the door, and it is the Jehovah's Witnesses with their watchtowers, and they begin their spiel, and I say to them very politely, I understand that this is your religion, and it's a good religion, and I said, I like all religions, I think they're good, and that the people are drawn to the religion that they need, and they are advanced and developed by that, and so even though yours is a good religion, I'm really not interested in pursuing it right now. And one of the men looks at me and he says, what about the thuggies? He apparently had been well educated into how to deal with different kinds of answers and to get a foot in the door. The thuggies are people that belong to the cult of Kali. And Kali is one of the names of the counterpart of Shiv in Indian mythology. And she is, in the same way that there is a mother creator and a mother nurturer, she is sort of the Hecate of India. She's the mother destroyer. And in the cult of Kali, They are, it's sometimes called the cult of assassins. And so when I said all religions are good, he threw that at me. I had to laugh because it was a funny situation, but I proved to be much too impermeable for him to get at the way he would like to have gotten at me. There are differences between religions, and those differences are important mostly for the people who need them. But as we look at differences, we're going to do it very slightly, and we're going to do it very generously just to get at one idea. So as we speak comparatively, it's not going to be a competitive comparison. It won't be something like my religion can beat up your religion or anything like that. So let's go forward for just a very few minutes as gingerly as though we were walking on eggshells. The more ancient philosophies of spiritual becoming tend to be philosophies of unfoldment. And the more modern spiritual philosophies tend to be philosophies of unfoldment and soul growth. Almost all spiritual philosophies agree on soul growth, on unfoldment, meaning to say that we have divine propensities, divine capabilities in our being, and a large part of what we are doing in our daily life, in our ongoing evolution within the creation, is to unfold the divinity within our being. That is agreed on by everyone. There's no difference except that the method may be different according to the religion or according to the needs of the people. They develop different kinds of methods. The more modern philosophies, especially the Western philosophies, contend that unfoldment is not enough to describe and explain our part of the evolutionary creation. It doesn't even do enough to describe the evolutionary creation itself. Many of the very ancient philosophies were born when people still had an involutionary or an atavistic clairvoyance. In that outlook, seeing themselves coming into matter and concurrently losing their clairvoyance, which had less of a feel of spiritual reality to it than the realms from which they were coming, they tended to see concrete matter as illusion, and as an illusion to be eschewed. Not only that, they tended to see concrete matter and the stuff of this world as a distraction. If this philosophy is sufficient with regard to unfoldment, if that were true, then all one would have to do is retreat from the world or to dissociate from the world and practice exercises until one had unfolded all of the latent powers and became a spiritual being. And then one could fly away from the material world and all of its illusions and all of its evil. A lot of those very ancient philosophies believed that matter was evil. Even going all the way into Persia, they believed that. Now, that's a somewhat simplistic statement of that kind of philosophy, but for clarity and brevity, it's reasonably accurate. You find a lot of such philosophies in the world right now. In fact, for us as Western people to try to follow those philosophies is very difficult because everything in our daily lives would not be in sync with the philosophy, and we would be philosophically thinking one way and having to live in a world that was another way, and in that there would be a good deal of psychological inconsistency. It would be very hard for us to live. As we said a few moments ago, the soul growth school of thought does not deny unfoldment. It just says that there is more to reality in our part in reality, and that something more is extremely important. If the exclusively unfoldment school were true, it would mean that we went through this vast involution to build things into our being, such as our physical body, which is a marvel of creative complexity. And then after that, we would pass through an evolution during which latencies would be unfolded, and that the application to spiritual exercises would hasten that unfoldment, but that those vehicles were built for not more than that. That kind of philosophy, in my eyes, is inadequate. It describes an evolution, and the evidence for an evolution is undeniable. It doesn't have to be the same evidence that material science sees or interpreted in the same way that material science sees it, but it's undeniable. But it does not address the fact that what we are in is also a creation. So what we are participating in is an evolutionary creation. It is a creation in the potential, in the unknown, in the unspeakable of the absolute. The universal spirit is creating in that potential as much as we are, because we are foci of the universal spirit. It's impossible that we can create new things, and that the universal spirit, the prime participant, isn't also creating new things. And they are new things. I think that there is some of this philosophy, this ancient philosophy, still permeates part of the Old Testament of the Bible. When Solomon writes, there's nothing new under the sun, I think that's an old way of looking at things. It's not a new way of looking at things such that there is creation of things that have never been there before. More of the ideas and the principles that we're learning may have been there and may be unknown to us, but there are new things. It's not like a teacher teaching the same grade every year and teaching the same thing to a new batch of kids every year with no appreciable change in the teacher. Kids do new things that have never been seen before, and they get more out of it than generations before them did. And the teacher becomes more insightful. Everything advances. And it doesn't advance by just going over something that's been there before. Now what this means is that given the same process, it's possible to get more out of it. This means that in our creation, there are very insightful creators that have applied themselves and have applied the creative spirit with great intensity, and they're getting more out of it. There couldn't be something like initiation unless this were possible. So the differences between these philosophies are real, and they are true, and there is a stuff, a soul stuff or a soul power that enables different spiritual beings to do more creativity. From this point of view, to think that we're being walked through a process that has no intrinsic value or importance in itself other than a predetermined state of consciousness is not only inadequate, to me it approaches blasphemy. If it's nothing more than that. The things that we do here are real and they're important. We weren't just brought here to escape being here. That's a kind of thinking that I think is highly unhealthy. This world is more than an illusion, and it's more than a trick being played on us. And this world is good and it's important in ways that go beyond being gotten over. If you think about it in a really simple fashion, to think otherwise is to think that, that this world is only good in the same way that banging your head against the wall is good because you feel good when it's over and when it's done. That's not a healthy way of doing it at all. We're building character, and we're building character from unlimited potential. And we're creating new things. Other people may have had the same discoveries that we have had. I've had it happen many times in life. It's almost a joke among my friends. I have a lot of friends that read Rudolf Steiner. And I'll be doing my own thing, living my own life, and then I'll come up with a discovery, and I'll say, wow, I've really discovered something here, and I'll start sharing it with my friends, and they'll say, oh, Rudolf Steiner wrote about that in such and such book or something like that. And at first I was disappointed because I thought I was an original, that I had a first. And then, of course, my self-esteem took over and said, well, I'm in good company. But now I see it all differently yet. I see it that the discovery and seeing it in a new way, because even though it is a discovery that was originally made by Rudolf Steiner or somebody before him, when I discovered it for myself, it was new and in a different way. So no one person, no one teaching tells it all and says it all, because somebody's going to come along living it, and it's going to be a better thing. It's going to be a new creation. So we're building character from unlimited potential, and we're creating new things, not for ourselves, but for the shared universal glory of the universal spirit. If we do create something or discover something, we don't want it for ourselves. We want it to share with others. And that's what it's like, sharing with the universal spirit, that everyone gets it. Magic is a form of creation. But it's not like transferring money from one account to another account. There is a creative element in magic. It isn't just a simple morphology. Even if it's the same cosmic root stuff that is being used by all creation or all magic, it's something new that's being made out of it, which means that there are new powers to the universal spirit. And to perform magic and to do creative work is something that requires soul power. There's a lot of magical thinking where people fantasize and think that they make changes magically. But to really change nature and to really create within the stuff of existence requires soul power. That means spiritual exercises that foster soul power, or what Max Heindel calls moral muscle, are the kind of exercises that we want to practice, because it isn't just unfolding. It is unfolding through a creative process. So even though most of our practice is right here in the material world, this doesn't mean that we only do worldly things and that we do the same things over and over again in the material world ad infinitum. We progress just as readily and just as rapidly as the people who are trying to eschew and dissociate from the material world. Discrimination is required. We have to discriminate when we have learned something, and we have to discriminate when we're being attached to the material world and how we're progressing. We have to give ourselves as thoroughly as we can, and we have to have a pyramid of values of what is relatively more significant. So now that we've gotten the idea that there are exercises that can harvest soul power, let's start looking at retrospection as an exercise, as a means to soul power, soul growth, and above all, creativity and character building. Because we're not divine if we're not creative as the Spirit is creative. The retrospection exercise is very simple. It's deceptively simple. The practitioner retires at the end of the day and remembers the events of the day in reverse order. The last thing before retiring, and then the thing before that, and the thing before that. One tries to picture the events clearly and objectively without personal bias. It is not merely a pictographic process. It is a feeling process. Much more a feeling process than a thinking process. One re-feels one's emotions, feelings, desires, all of those things. And that's the exercise. It's very simple. However, if you try to perform it, it proves to be not easy to perform at all. In fact, it is extremely difficult to perform. I've been working at it since 1963, and I can say that my progress has been very little. At least in my eyes, it's very little. However, all of the progress that has been made, little though it may be, and the times that I'm effective with it, have been very productive of soul growth, very productive of character growth and becoming a better human being. There have even been times where I've done special kind of retrospective work, which we may get to in this talk, but I don't think so. We've mentioned it in other talks that when we are humbled and we don't defend ourselves with a shield of egoism and self-importance, when that happens, with humility we are opened and the Spirit can flow into the personality and it can be healed and it can be improved. Well, what I have found about this exercise is that it's always humbling. And if nothing else, it improves in that way. Since this exercise is so important, we're going to look at it from a lot of points of view. Max Heindel said of this exercise that if the worst criminal living in the world could be prevailed upon to perform the exercise faithfully every day with full sincerity, that person would be completely reformed in a matter of months. You're talking about a very powerful exercise. That's potent, because character is not an easy thing to change. Let's look into some of the reasons why it is so difficult. Now, if you ever study psychoanalysis or undergo therapy of some kind or another, you run into the phenomenon of masking memories. I believe that the term masking memories originated with Sigmund Freud. A masking memory is a memory that comes to mind very easily and very readily. It's something that you can call back really easy. And it's usually a pleasant memory. But sometimes it's neutral. But it comes to your mind very easily. With alacrity, you can call it to mind. Now, the psychoanalysts, Freud, later on Jung, used basically similar techniques. And the essence of the technique was getting the patient to remember various things from the past. The patient, wanting to be healed, gradually thought past the simple things of life and progressed into the more painful memories that were the basis of a disturbance in the soul. In psychoanalysis, the emphasis was placed first on just neutral memory and then on analyzing it mentally. Sometimes in this kind of work, one encounters clusters of associated memories, and sometimes one encounters one extremely painful, traumatic memory that has a huge influence on life. Now, when there are painful clusters of memory, or there is an exceedingly traumatic memory, it's something like the way a scab forms over a wound. Around that nexus of painful memories, masking memories form. And those masking memories are associated with the sore spot, and part of their existence is to comfort the stress. But a big part of the function of masking memories is similar to the function of a scantily clad cocktail waitress in a blackjack casino. Is you look at the waitress and you're not paying attention to what you're doing. Many of our bad habits are masking phenomena, such that if we quit smoking or quit drinking coffee or whatever we're using to mask something that we don't want to face, if we quit that and we don't take up a new mask, then we're forced to face avoiding what we have avoided all along. I smoked for about 4 or 5 years. I smoked about 3 packs a day for 5 years. A lot of smoking. And I can remember when I started smoking. I was very insecure. I didn't have an identity. And when I smoked, I figured I would have an identity if I smoked. And I even smoked in a manner like somebody that I admired who did have an identity. After those 5 years were over and I was struggling to quit, I was able to quit, but then I was faced with the fact that I was still insecure and still had doubts about my identity, and I had to deal with that face to face. Now, when we think about this, a question immediately comes to mind. Why would we not want to face something that is still causing us discomfort? Why don't we just face it and get it over? The answer to that is that in the lower nature, we have this personal ego, or this pseudo-self, that does not want to cede the control that it usurped from the divine self. It was created to protect us, and it became like the fox guarding the chickens. It protected us, but it set up its own, it's sort of like an alderman, it set up its own power base and had its own strength. If we begin to admit to our sins, and if we open our weaknesses to the divine part of our being, that the self is going to become stronger, and it's going to come into the body more. And in doing that, the lower self is going to have to cede its control, which it is very loath to do. It would just as soon revel in its little fiefdom that has all the corruption and all the indulgence in it, even though there's self-destruction in that. It's perfectly happy. It satisfies its desires very well on the negative activities in life. It's like a petty gang leader that's willing to have a good amount of slashing and carnage just to show its power and just to have some action. The world thinks that way. Sometimes people will take a punch to get at the opponent. Now that's the way we see it because we're unsophisticated. The sophisticated name for this among the psychiatrists, it is called psychological resistance. The psychiatrists recognize that there is a lower ego nature. Some of them even recognize that there's a higher spiritual self. But they just call it psychological resistance, and they don't understand the long-term evolution of how the lower nature came to be and what its original function was and where everything is going in evolution. So they just see it as psychological resistance. If we are to become whole people, and if we are to have inner harmony, where we have an internal dialogue, where when we talk to ourselves, we're not arguing, we're not fighting, but we're talking like Thomas à Kempis talks to the Christ within, where the lower nature asks questions like, why is the world like this, or what is behind this phenomenon, and the answers come from the Spirit. It's called the Hermetic Dialogue. Before the ancient initiations, the candidate for initiation always had to go before the Hierophant, and it was a matter of question and answer. And in living through that activity, it's just like learning to be tamed in our own being, where we have an inner dialogue that is peaceful and that is fruitful. So this lower nature has to be tamed to become a valuable partner. If you don't think that you have a petty tyrant in you, try the exercise. Try making all the changes you want to make. When you try the exercise, just watch where you fall asleep. When you wake up the next morning, see where you fell asleep. And it's almost always when you had to face a bad attitude or a disgraceful deed or something like that. This is one of the reasons why the exercise is so hard. I had a friend that was so determined to do this exercise that she stood in the shower with the water running to do the exercise and still had difficulty with it. It's just not easy She was still falling asleep. If you want to grow, if you really want to grow, and it isn't just a desire, but an urge of the Spirit, it can be done, and it does get easier. I can't say that I have gotten fully to that point myself. I try very hard to grow, but building up the soul power to have that command of the Spirit come fully into the personality just isn't there yet. There are other reasons why the exercise is difficult. If you'll remember, we spent 3 talks on the life cycle. We talked about the moment of death, when the seed atom is released from the heart, and it passes up through the silver cord, and then it goes with the Spirit after the silver cord is snapped. At that time, something very important happened. One saw one's life in reverse. Even coming close to death, one sees one's life in reverse. Well, usually, it happens with near deaths by drownings, which significantly change the character seeing the pictures. One, at that time, when they see their life, they see it backwards. They see it in reverse order. We talked quite a bit how from first heaven all the way through birth, we're always looking forward. A baby looks forward to when it can walk. Eventually we look forward to going to school, or to having a sweetheart, or to driving a car, or to having a career. We're always looking forward. And somewhere in life, usually when children are born, we begin looking backwards. And then there's an overlap between forward-looking and backward-looking until death. And then it is all backward-looking at that point until back at third heaven, when the new creative impulse starts all over again. We noted that when the will to live, which is one expression of soul power, when that will to live was exhausted, everything unraveled, and the unraveling could not be resisted as it is resisted if we try to do retrospection. Subsequently, our bodies deteriorated, and as they deteriorated, our consciousness rose through the various spiritual worlds, and the essence of the experiences that formed our bodies was built into the Spirit, where it became soul material, soul power for future use. That's exactly what this exercise does. We said yesterday that for an exercise to be valuable, to be workable, to be sound, one of the criteria was that it had to be based on reality. That it couldn't be just something artificial. We can see then that this exercise is based on a cosmological activity that runs throughout everything in the evolutionary creation. Not only our coming to birth and dying, but the whole cycle of the entire creation is like that. In the second half, in the evolutionary half, we pull out of the worlds, and we have a grand retrospective activity, so that by the time we get to the Vulcan period, everything, all of what we do until the very, very end, when we do one last little stroke of positive work, everything is retrospective. Now we said that when you look forward, it winds you into matter, and it hardens the body. And that when we look backwards in memory or reviewing things, it tends to lift us out of the body and we fall asleep. So it isn't all just psychological resistance, it is a principle of nature. And this is a very good way to look at the exercise, because you can introduce people to something in an honest way. You can introduce them to one of the best spiritual exercises of all without them even knowing it. Because there are a lot of insomniacs out there. And I frequently get asked, what do you do for insomnia? And I give an exercise. And they take it as an exercise for insomnia. I guess you'd call it guerrilla mysticism. But it works like that. So doing this exercise voluntarily takes a great sacrifice of will to hold ourselves in the body. And that's one of the reasons why it is such a powerful exercise. Because it is a sacrifice of will, because in a small way you're going against what happens when things do spin backwards. In the body, the higher bodies want to lift out, and it takes a great effort to stay awake. Then in some spiritual schools, they put people through things where they have to stay awake for so many days and things like that. They could get the same effect by having them do a retrospection. If you'll note, all of these exercises are spiritual exercises. We haven't said anything about how you breathe or anything like that, because those are physical conditions. If one wants to grow spiritually, the attention is focused on spiritual things and not on physical conditions. Now, it should be pretty obvious that if we're doing this every day and immediately taking into the spirit our experience, we're getting to use the stuff of our daily lives as soul power almost immediately. We don't have to wait 750 to 1250 years before we can use it. It is living more right now. This exercise has an immediacy. And that immediacy is more than just paying attention. It is having the soul power that gives us the ability to pay attention. There are other reasons why we work in reverse order. And if we think about our lives, we can see that an entirely new perspective is given to us by doing things in reverse order. Any event is a moment in an ongoing train of causes and consequences. Normally, we live our lives in only one direction of that train of causes and consequences. We see a cause, we see a consequence. Sometimes we don't even follow out the cause to the consequence. We see a whole event, but we see it with only one outlook. When we retrospect, we're looking at things from consequences to causes. It's a very important thing, because it is sure. If you have a bunch of pool balls and you have the cue ball, you strike the cue ball and it's going to affect many balls. And that original cause, you may be trying to affect the ball at the far end of the assemblage, and you can probably do that, but you're not taking into account all of the other effects of one cause. There is a fan out between cause and all the consequences that come from that one cause. And so you're not always sure of the things that happen subsequently in your life, which of them are the result of what cause because of the fan out, and then, one ball will hit yet another ball and there'll be a fan out on a fan out. But when you're working from consequence backward to cause, it's indubitable. Suppose you're lying in bed and you're looking at the day in reverse order, and you note that you're more tired than normal. That when you went to bed, you were just barely able to crawl in. And then you start looking backwards, and you get a few frames backwards to like dinner time, and you see you ate a huge, big meal. And immediately you can see the intuition, if you're watching, the consequence tells you that without a doubt the cause was eating too much. It's a connection that is more clearly made by looking from consequence to cause. If we think about it then, one of the worst things we can do when we go to bed at night is to think about tomorrow. Because if we think about what we're going to do tomorrow, we're looking forward. And we grind ourselves into the world even more at the time when it's natural to release ourselves and withdraw from the world. I think you'll find that you have more dreams and you don't sleep as well if you're thinking about tomorrow when you go to sleep. It works that way with me. So we begin to appreciate antecedents. Now when we have seen something from cause to consequence and from consequence to cause, we have a very objective view of reality. That's exceedingly important because that's one of the things that we're learning here in this material world is to become objective. There are other important aspects about doing things in reverse order that are integral to understanding this exercise. So to get at them, let's return to memory for a minute. There are several different kinds of memory. We have the intellectual memory in the brain, which is a consequence of traces and things like that. It's valuable, but it's not very good. Then we have the personal etheric memory at the negative poles of the reflecting ether in our vital body. This memory, if we can learn to access it, is far superior to brain memory. It contains everything. Great accuracy. It's even a better quality than a photograph or a video or anything like that. There are even better memories, but it'll be a while before we have access to them, and they really aren't pertinent to what we're trying to get at, so we won't pursue them. Now, one of the things about this personal etheric memory that is so good is that it naturally unwinds in reverse order as we dissociate from the physical body. When we access it or attempt to access it, we automatically leave our body. And being out of the physical body and all of our identification with the physical body, we are then freed from very much of a personal perspective. We're not attached. And we're not limited by any of the senses. So we have an objective, unattached view in the etheric memory, and we have something that is so whole that we can get more than we normally get when we're living our life. One of the most important features of this breath memory is that it's alive and that it's flexible to adaptation. You know that you can focus a camera or a telescope or something like that so that you can cause something to be blown up, or you can see it in different ways according to the way that you have the aperture set. Well, you can do the same thing with this memory. It's very adaptable. You can see the events of the day very swiftly, in a matter of seconds, if you're in touch with it, or you can slow things down to an almost stopped motion. This memory is so flexible that with your consciousness you can step into it. And that's really important. If through this memory we can re-experience the events of the day by seeing them from a perspective different than the perspective we had when we were inside the body, this is not only a reversal in time of cause and consequence, it is a reversal in perspective. It produces extremely objective consciousness. Normally, we're like the person playing the chess game or playing the card game or playing the football game. We're inside of it and we have a certain subjectivity. But we all know that the kibitzers see things that the players who are playing don't see. The grandstand quarterback is legendary for the ability to have an objectivity that the quarterback on the field looks like a dummy at. And this is precisely what we get if we are doing retrospection and we can put ourselves in the etheric memory, even if we don't walk into it, but just put ourselves into the images from the other person's point of view. It is enormously powerful in terms of objectivity. Oh, would some God the gift He gave us to see ourselves as others see us. And if everyone around us, with all of their perspicacity and insight, were to tell us things that they see about us, from that we could determine all sorts of things that we never see with the subjectivity of being inside of our body. So with this reverse of the field of perspective, we know not only how we felt when we were emoting, but we know how other people experienced our emotions. It's one thing to see that we were harsh and we can feel the same angry words or thoughts going out of us. It's another thing to have the perspective of what it's like when somebody's shouting at you and how it feels, what you've done. This facilitates one of the most important features of the exercise: re-feeling, re-emoting all of our desires. From one point of view, any unredeemed causes and consequences are undesirable. All unredeemed destiny is bad destiny. Any sharp investor can tell you the value of being liquid. If you have fluid assets, you can change quickly, and advantages are available to you that are not available to you if you're bound up in investments that don't change. So one of the objectives of this exercise is to neutralize and to discharge the emotional content that causes us to be hung up, and that causes us to have a backlog of sin or to have emotional complexes or anything like that. Because we carry a lot of stuff around with us. So this is, again, has multiple positive effects for us. The positive effects are we won't have hang-ups, and any tendency to move in that direction gets cleared up right away. And we have the essence taken out right away, and we can use it right away. This is done by refeeling. That's a strange word. Actually, it's a neologism by myself. But you're feeling it both ways. This is important because memories, if they aren't refelt, they hang in us. And there's an enormous amount of energy that we have in that. We hear these things of people being able to lift a car to save someone's life or doing other miraculous things. That's because they have no energy bound up in other stuff. Now, if emotions are not refelt but remembered subjectively, you get something out of them. But sometimes, if you just feel an emotion over again and again and again, and you aren't objective about it, that emotion actually gets stronger. We know people who have their memory tapes, and they become vengeful, and they live the same thought over again and again and again, and it gets to be a really hardened thing. So when we're talking about refeeling, we're not just talking about a repetition, which would have the opposite effect of what we're trying to get to. We're trying to do the refeeling in such a way that it is sincere and as it is felt by others. It can't be a neutral activity or a non-feeling activity. This is why the primal therapy of Arthur Janov is so effective. It could be even more effective if this reversal of perspective were kept in mind. Janov claims that intellectual analysis in psychiatric work is not necessary if we just refeel the events. Because if we refeel the events, the insights will be there anyway. And that's right. If we just review the events and intellectually think about them, an analysis or any kind of counseling may not be successful. But if we refeel, then we're sure to be successful because the insight comes with the soul power. Unfortunately, the Janovians, the primal therapists, make a few mistakes. They not only do not reverse the perspective, they do not usually reverse the time sequence. And what they do is they go for the events at the very beginning of life, birth traumas and cradle traumas and things like that. And when that happens, it is through the very earliest events in life that the past life character is built into the physical body. In that time of sensitivity, what we need to have as part of our physical structure, the kind of formation and malformation of our bodies, the kind of things that the Rolfers try to Rolf out physically, they get built in. And they are there so that we can continue to work on our destiny from past lives in the physical body throughout this physical life. So if you knock out the birth traumas and the infantile traumas, you have wiped out your connection with the past lives. And what you get, if you've ever seen a primal patient that has done that, you get somebody that's very peaceful, but their life is just a little too peaceful. Everything is gone. If a person has had a really traumatic life, somebody that has been blitzed with drug phenomena, and so they're barely held together, sometimes that's important. A perfect example of primal therapy before and after is John Lennon. John Lennon went through primal therapy, and afterwards he was content to just sit around at home. They actually did a record. He and Yoko actually did a record where they recorded as part of their music their primal screams. So they make the mistake of not starting in the present and working backwards. And so what they do is, in effect, is they make a break in the line of consciousness that proceeds back deep into our spiritual history. So the way of retrospection is far superior if we can do it with that same kind of emotional intensity, because we're looking both from a reverse perspective and from a reverse sequence. Now, it should be apparent that the way we're looking at this pretty analytically. And we're looking at this in terms of psychology. We're looking at it in terms of the ongoing cosmology. And that isn't necessary to do the exercise. What is more necessary is to be simply doing it, to be sincere, and to be self-honest. If we keep that in mind, that we are sincere and self-honest, we can't help but to succeed. It's amazing how self-honesty improves as you go on with it. At first you think you're all so honest, and then you see things about your attitudes, and you see things that you carry with you, and after a while you realize there are many deep levels of self-honesty that you never knew about before. Let's look at it. Let's simplify the exercise for a second. Sometimes we have lives that are so demanding that we only have a few minutes, not because of psychological resistance, but just because of exhaustion, that we're going to drop off to sleep anyway. One can then do the exercise in a different way. I've done it a few times in life, and it's been exceedingly fruitful. One begins by facing one's conscience, either in the face of the higher self, or of Christ, or something like that, and asks to be cleansed and disburdened of all of the moral and psychological weight and limitation, or even the abundances of joy. If one is really sincere and really obedient to the higher self, the reverse perspective will be very fast, and the Spirit will call up before your attention only the most important images, and they'll pass before your inner eye, and you can look at them without having to look at all the minutiae. Because even in terms of resistance, this kind of performance is sometimes important. Because the lower nature is so subtle and so wily, it can act like it's cooperating. And it can have us seeing what finger we used to press down the cap on the toothpaste and things like that. And, you get distracted in all those little things, and you're not really looking at the big things. How you cheated on somebody or something like that. If one is sincere and just sets it in reverse, the Spirit knows what's important. And this is based on a principle of nature. And the principle of nature works throughout all of our bodies. Our bodies, in their natural function, as they were archetypally designed to be, will not tolerate things inimical to them. And they will get rid of the things that are most inimical to them first. At one time, I went through an alternative cancer therapy called Gerson therapy. Hundreds of people, thousands of people have gone through it. Charles Weber knows a lot about it because he worked with the society. In Los Angeles, the Cancer Control Society that did a lot with Gerson patients. But it is a matter of fact that when you work therapeutically on your physical body and begin both strengthening it and cleansing it, the physical body will know what is most dangerous to it. And the first things it will get rid of are malignant tumors, because the body senses. On the other hand, You may have benign tumors. It's much harder by a natural therapy to cleanse the body of benign tumors than it is to cleanse it of malignant tumors. And this happens all the way through our being. The spirit and all of its bodies really does want to be disburdened. Criminals often confess crimes because they can't bear the onus of the guilt. It weighs on them so hard. Similarly, there are things that the Spirit wishes to harvest, both good and bad. So our tendencies to the good are reinforced. All one has to do is be sincere and trust in the higher nature. To trust in the divine that is in us. The lower nature can get in touch with this memory too, and it can do it in a really quickly way. We've had experiences of that. We've all confessed sometimes to a friend some heinous thing we've done and asked the strictest confidence, and then the friend gets angry with us, and in a moment of anger they throw it in our face because their lower nature brought it out of the memory just that quickly. It wanted to do the most devastating thing that it could, and it had access to the memory, and it did it the same way. So the lower nature will allow us to look at our peccadillos and let the more serious sins wax and foster. So sincerity is an important thing. If we have not been successful in accessing the memory and the reflecting ether, which would give us all of our experiences, then we have to rely on dedication to the higher self. Sometimes even relying on mnemonics to remember things. Anything to face reality. If we really want to improve, and if we really don't want to hang on to all kinds of stuff that disturb us, that's a heuristic thing. Remember one of the things we said about all the spiritual exercises, they have to be self-educational. And that every time we turn inward in a spiritual exercise, everything that happens is sacred. Suppose we're trying to pray, and we're trying to pray in the most beautifully devotional way possible, and we turn inward to do that. Then suppose what happens to me sometimes, or it has happened in the past, suppose lustful thoughts and images come to mind. That's an example that if you take that as a sacred moment, you realize that those are the things that you're not dealing with in your retrospection. Everything that you do when you turn inward, especially in the special moments of spiritual exercise, everything that happens is important. And it's self-educational, and it tells us what we need to do. If we're angry with someone and we can't pray because we're angry with someone, that means we need to do retrospection big time, and that's the thing that we have to retrospect, and not just retrospect our self-justifying view of what we're angry about. I think I'm going to have to cut material here. Sometimes the psychological charge of things is so much that we can't look at them, at the things in the personal subconscious, without being distracted. Sometimes, anytime an image comes up, we are immediately re-enraged. And it requires judgment. That's what spiritual growth is all about. It's exactly as the ancient Greeks said, "Gnothi se autan," know thyself. It's important that we see ourselves and know ourselves and judge ourselves with the highest and most accurate objective judgment that we can make. If we only judge ourselves negatively, we're going to become mopes. We're going to become dreary, dark people. If we only see positive things about ourselves, we might develop a positivity about ourselves that is full-blown with self-importance. The things we see may be true, but we may make more of ourselves. So we have to have some kind of sincerity and good sound judgment. And a good part of that is being humble. So there are some times that things are so charged that our judgment is obscured. And when that occurs, it's all right to look at the pictures neutrally, or as neutrally as possible. It has an effect anyway. We can't always get into the objectivity of those etheric images, but that doesn't mean we quit. We go ahead and do it anyway. And sometimes when we are very, very burdened, we can do it as a matter of confession. In this respect, Catholics may have an advantage. Confession is not a substitute for retrospection. But sometimes it does utilize a lot of the same principles, and it can work for the same ends. And since we're all part of something together, and often working together with other human beings is very important to our development, being intimate with them, sometimes confessing to someone outside of ourselves is extremely humble, and it does a good deal for us to be able to honestly and with full feeling. You have to be careful. You're laying yourself on the line when you do it, but if we want to be cleansed, sometimes we have to do something like that. I'm very positive about people going to counselors if they feel they need to be disburdened. I'm positive about people going to friends or to associates, provided those associates are going to keep the experience sacred. The thing that is important about confession, which is usually negative, is that it is intended to be in an atmosphere of sincerity. For a lot of Catholics, it has the quality of being very insincere. In such a case, the Catholics at a disadvantage rather than at an advantage. You know that what I found now for the last 15 or 20 years is that more people who come to the esoteric Christian path come from Catholicism than from Protestantism or from non-believers. It is because of the sincerity, and I think because of the repetition, that this is the case. Yes?
So we don't go anymore to the priest confess to ourselves.
Yes, but I'm saying that sometimes it's important to confess to another human being. I don't want to get sidetracked into that whole subject because it's a very delicate subject. Sometimes we have to see Christ in others and confess to Christ and confess to Christ through others. So the exercise does not necessarily have to be a solo exercise where it's just you and yourself. One can get beyond self, and one can do this exercise very thoroughly by refilling as one is doing it to the Christ. In fact, in some instances in the Rosicrucian literature, this exercise is called the forgiveness of sins. Now this brings out another side to it. Because when we refeel something, or we re-experience an emotional event from consequence to cause, the emotional energy in it is released. We've discussed that. It's freed. so that we are people who can do things with our feelings, and we're not limited and all tied up in our hang-ups, in our complexes. At the same time that the energy is freed, the essence of the experience, the spiritual meaning of the experience, is also freed. When something is seen in this way, it is seen into the spirit. That is how soul power is actually harvested. It is absorbed into the spirit because the spirit is absorbed in the process. And then it is assimilated to the parent principle in the spirit so that it is immediately available to the spirit. That's why this attitude of confession is so important, because it takes it deep into the spirit. If it is to the divine nature, it accesses parts of our being that we normally do not access in the personality. That kind of thing, with the wisdom of the spirit, can guide the retrospection in a way that is phenomenal. Even great confessors are that way. In the last several years, I've been studying the life of the Saint Padre Pio, who could leave the body, and he had full clairvoyance and everything else. But people relating their confessions to Padre Pio, it's quite something. They would confess something, and they would think that they were clear, and Padre Pio would say to them, don't you think you're missing something? And if they'd say no, he would call up a picture in their own aura to them of something that they had confessed. And a confession with him, because he was fully clairvoyant, he could call up the things that were torturing the soul, that were burdening it in a very painful way. This is what initiation is. Now, when one extracts the soul material, one has a spiritual experience, a very tiny spiritual experience. When one sees the meaning of an event into the spirit, when that occurs, it's a two-way street. And there is an intuition of the spirit into the personality. So that this is indeed as deep of a spiritual exercise as can be, because the spirit is more involved in its bodies, in its vehicles, in a living way, because the intuition in them has spiritualized the bodies. Now that's something that is extremely important. That's what spiritual growth really is. We're spiritualizing our vehicles. This exercise also has a cosmological feature about it, in that it is voluntary. If it's involuntary, as it is at death, the effect is still there, but it's not the same thing as it is if it is a living sacrifice. It's a very completing and accomplishing thing. It's like an initiation. An initiation is the beginning of a life of freedom. And one does everything in the initiation with complete freedom. An initiation doesn't happen to you. It isn't given to you by someone else. You freely live yourself into the initiation. And so in a very small way, this exercise is that. That's about as far as I want to go for this morning. So we could say more, but it's, I think, enough so that I hope everybody's inspired to go and work and try harder at working at the exercise. So let's close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. Oh God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength